When does a string of bad luck stop becoming coincidental and seems to be something else hell bent on making your life miserable? Just imagine this for a moment. You wake up one morning, your phone is dead. But then you realize, oh my gosh, you've overslept. You're late for an important meeting. As you rush out the door, you miss a curb and end up twisting your ankle. You manage to limp to your car only to find that it won't start. When you finally somehow make it to work, your boss calls you into their office. Your heart sinks as they inform you that due to budget cuts, your position is being eliminated. On your way home, you get a call from your sister. Your mother's in the hospital. It's nothing life-threatening, but she'll need surgery and a long recovery. You might chalk this up to being a spectacularly bad day. But what if it's more than that? What if these aren't just random occurrences, but a pattern? Something that seems to be working against you. Throughout history, people have reported having strings of bad luck that just seem too coordinated to be coincidence. Some parapsychologists believe that these strings of bad luck could be some unknown force working in your life, whose purpose is to, in essence, make your life miserable. Others will point to the concept of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK, where intense emotional states are thought to influence the physical world around us. Could your own stress and anxiety be inadvertently attracting more misfortune? Manifestation, anyone? Or it might be something dark working in your life, something you didn't ask for, but walked into it having no idea about what was about to start happening in your life. Nothing you had power over, nothing you caused, yet something is definitely going on, and you don't know how to stop it. Remember, in the world of the paranormal, there's often a fine line between bad luck and something far more creepy. These are the kinds of things that happened to LaToya Ammons in 2011 in Gary, Indiana. And for her, this was only just the beginning of an experience that was both terrifying and mentally exhausting, not only for her, but her kids and her mother. This is the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth, and this is Demons in Indiana. Before we dive into today's episode, if you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and the paranormal, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share the podcast with others who crave these kinds of mysteries. Your support helps us keep bringing you stories like this one and ensures that you won't miss out on future episodes. The house on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana, looked just like every other house. Its white siding had faded from years in the sun. The porch was worn and creaked in various places. But this house would become a personal hell for LaToya Ammons, her kids, and her mom as they moved into the rental home in November 2011. It began as something strange. Hordes of horseflies on the front porch in December in Indiana. Temperatures hit the freezing mark on a regular basis, and insects had no business showing up in the dead of winter. Then came the footsteps. Both LaToya and her mom, Rosa, would hear footsteps coming up from the basement. They were heavy and deliberate. They would stop, but then they'd hear the creak of the basement door opening, a door that they kept closed. Every time they went to check it out, no one was there, but the basement door still stood open. This was just the beginning for the Ammons family. What LaToya and her family didn't know was that her family's experience wasn't the first time that bad luck had happened in that house. What if this had roots to something disturbing that went back almost a century to another family who once lived there? A family whose story had been forgotten, or maybe even hidden. Back then, no one talked about the supernatural. The stigma from claiming that something was happening inside your home that no one could explain came along with judgment and all but being blacklisted from the community. If no one talked about it, how would anyone know? Well, nearly a century ago, newspapers pried into almost every corner of everyone's life. You would know if Mrs. Smith down the street was expecting company, where they were coming from, and how long they'd stay. You'd also see job promotions, even job changes, address changes. All of this was in public view for everyone. Because of this, we could piece together some kind of clues that indicated even nearly a century ago that something evil might have been happening inside this house. The house where the Ammons now lived was built in 1926. Its first owners were the Burnsides, a family with a story that just seemed to be filled with bad luck. Back in the day, Gary, Indiana was a booming town built by U.S. Steel to house thousands of workers who were drawn to work in the mills. Berlin Burnside wasn't one of these workers. He was a firefighter for the city of Gary. He and his wife, Mary, had 2 young children, Imogene and Lowell. And for decades, they lived in the house on Carolina Street. Now, at first, nothing seemed strange, or at least as far as we know. But thanks to the newspapers at the time, we can discover that maybe things weren't all as they may have seemed inside that home. In 1932, 1 year after their son Lowell was born, Berlin Burnside got sick. He was sick for months and ended up needing surgery to remove his gallbladder. But it didn't end there. The next year, in 1933, Berlin had developed a severe infection, which forced him back into the hospital. In 1934, his car was rear-ended with his daughter, Imogene, in the passenger seat. Both of them were injured, but the details about Imogene's condition were not disclosed. In 1935, Berlin had pneumonia so severe he had to be hospitalized again. This time, though, his 4-year-old son, Lowell, also became sick, and both father and son were in the hospital together for the same infection. A year later, as Berlin was working at the fire station, a fire broke out. Its origin? Undetermined. But it did seem like the Burnside family just seemed to have bad luck year after year. For a time, things seemed to calm down, at least as far as we know, because all we know is that the newspapers didn't mention their names for quite some time. We don't know what was happening inside the house. What is known is that at some point, Berlin was made captain at the fire department, which likely came with an uptick in pay and more responsibilities. Then, in 1943, a new mayor of Gary was brought in, and this mayor decided to demote Berlin along with 6 other firefighters from their positions. The Burnside family was hit by sickness, accidents, mysterious fires, and demotions within a very short period of time. A string of bad luck. They finally moved from the house by 1976 and took off for Portage, Indiana, which is literally just a few miles away. And this is where they lived out the remainder of their lives. The house on Carolina Street still stood. Now, although records from this time period are hazy at best, we do know that by the time that Charles Reed became its landlord in 2011, when LaToya and her family moved in, the house had passed through a few hands. What happened in that house between 2011 and 2014, when it was finally demolished, would make what happened to the Burnsides look like child's play. In November of 2011, it was a cold day for moving. Temperatures barely reached 46 degrees during the day, and they dipped below freezing at night. This is the day that LaToya Ammons, her 3 young kids, and her mom, Rosa, moved into their new rental home at 3860 Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. The house was sturdy, but it showed its age. The basement was a bit odd. There was a small detail about this basement that was different, but not disturbing, just different. At first glance, you would overlook it, but this area would soon become the focal point of suspicion. Most of the basement floor was concrete, typical for a house of that age, which would have probably started off in 1926 with a dirt floor, but over the years would have been upgraded to poured concrete. The thing was, under the basement stairs, there was a portion of the floor that remained uncovered by concrete. It was just dirt. This wasn't all that unusual. Sometimes these patches were there to save money on concrete, thinking there was no reason to put that there, or it was there to access utilities. Sometimes, though, there were darker reasons. Some traditions believed that leaving an area of dirt in the basement would keep bad energy from becoming trapped within the walls. In other cases, these patches of dirt were places to bury or conceal things that were made to stay hidden. Something about this patch of dirt didn't sit well with one police officer who would later investigate the home. He noted how the concrete floor and the dirt didn't meet naturally. It ended with a jagged edge, as if the floor had been there before, but someone had chipped it away. But why? Now, in December of 2011, December in the Midwest usually means cold weather. You rarely get days above freezing. Even if you do, it's definitely not warm enough for insects. Yet, day after day, LaToya and her mom, Rosa, found themselves swatting away swarms of horseflies that seemed to have taken over the screened-in porch. Later, Rosa would say, "We killed them and killed them and killed them, but they kept coming back. It didn't make any sense. The porch was barely warmer than the air outside, and nothing was there to draw these flies in, yet there they were." As 2012 began, so did the noises. After midnight, LaToya and Rosa would hear heavy footsteps climbing the basement stairs. The footsteps would stop, and you would hear the slow creak of the basement door opening. Each time they went to check it out, the basement door would be ajar, but no one was there. This happened so many times that LaToya and Rosa would sleep with their own doors open to see if they could see who or what it was coming up these steps into their house. The kids also began having experiences around this time. LaToya's two boys, ages 7 and 9, would spend time in a closet, whispering and laughing as if someone were in there with them. When they were asked what they were doing, they would describe a new quote-unquote friend, a child just like them. This friend, however, was telling the boys some pretty dark things. Things like they were going to hell and that they weren't going to God. Soon, the boys' behavior began to change, morphing into something disturbing. All of the kids, not only the boys, but LaToya's daughter as well, then began chanting together in low, rhythmic voices. They would chant numbers, but what made this so much more disturbing was that when one stopped the chant, the other one would pick up right where the last one ended. And then just as quickly as these episodes started, they'd end, with the kids just being kids, with no memory of what had just happened. As time went on, the kids then started to get sick. They would have high fevers, they would vomit, they would bleed from their mouths and their noses with no apparent cause. They were sick and they were tired from being kept up at night. And because of all of this, they didn't have the strength to go to school. LaToya was desperate. She knew something was wrong. So she reached out to local churches, literally pleading for help. Most turned her away. But one official finally came to the house and offered advice that was as shocking as it was dangerous. Cleanse the house by using bleach and ammonia, and then draw crosses on every door with olive oil. For those who know, bleach and ammonia, when used together, create something called chloramine gas, a substance so toxic it can be fatal in enclosed spaces. And this was winter in Indiana. The house was sealed tight against the cold. Now, we don't know if LaToya followed that dangerous suggestion, but what we do know is that she did eventually turn to a clairvoyant for answers. The clairvoyant's verdict seemed as unreal as it was chilling. The house was besieged by over 200 demons. Her advice? Move out. But for LaToya, that wasn't an option. She didn't have the means to just pack up and leave. So the clairvoyant helped them create a makeshift altar in the basement, placing a Bible and crosses upon this altar. They burned sage, walking from room to room, reading Psalm 91, the prayer of protection, aloud, hoping to reclaim their home from whatever had taken hold. For 3 days, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no flies, no strange behavior. But then, just as they were beginning to hope it was over, things got worse, much worse. On March 10th, 2012, LaToya had a family gathering at her home. A loved one had passed away, and everyone was there to support one another. LaToya's 12-year-old daughter and a friend were in their grandmother's room, tired and sleeping from the exhausting events of the day. When LaToya walked in to check on them, she froze. There, suspended in midair, hovering above the bed, was her daughter, completely unconscious. LaToya screamed for her mom, and every family member still in the house came running to the room. They all stood in shock, not knowing how to voice what it was they were seeing. Complete fear took over. Several family members dropped to their knees and began to pray. As they did, LaToya's daughter began to slowly lower back onto the bed. When she woke up, she had no memory of what had just happened. By now, LaToya and Rosa were convinced. This was something evil. Whatever had entered their home had taken hold of the children. The signs were unmistakable. Their eyes would bulge, their faces would twist into unsettling, sinister smiles, and their voices would drop into a dark, guttural tone that seemed to belong to someone or something else. But it wasn't just the kids. LaToya, too, began to feel a darkness creeping over her. She'd feel waves of weakness wash over her. Her body would shake uncontrollably. Heat would pulse through her, and a sense of dread settled inside of her. It was as if something was reaching out to her, trying to take control. Desperation drove LaToya and Rosa to a breaking point. They needed help, real, tangible help. So LaToya reached out to her Baptist church and a local evangelist, hoping for relief. They did come to the house and perform cleansing rituals, prayers, anything they could think of to drive out whatever was there. But it was as if the house itself was resistant to their efforts, unwilling to release whatever had taken hold of LaToya and her family. Now, at the house, activity then seemed to ramp up. The kids began to tell their mom about what they had been seeing, a young boy and this elderly woman. They would appear without warning and then disappear just as fast. Even outside of the house, the kids' disturbing behavior was noticed by all of those that knew them. The kids would chant, they would cuss, they would act out violently, something that was completely out of character for all of them. They were also attacked at home. They were pushed by unseen forces. Strange bruises began to appear on their bodies. All through March and a couple of weeks into April of 2012, activity got worse. LaToya needed to do something, and she didn't know where to turn. So she decided to take the kids in to see their family doctor. Now, if hell could be a month for LaToya and her family, it would be April of 2012. While waiting to see the doctor, LaToya decided to take her family and stay in a hotel. They just couldn't be in that house any longer. This didn't help anything. If anything, the activity was worse. They then decided to head to LaToya's brother's house, but the activity followed them there, too. Even LaToya's brother was witness to the chants and the unseen forces throwing the kids against the walls. Finally, on April 19th, LaToya took her kids to the doctor, which would set off a very long and heart-wrenching chain of events. So on April 19th, LaToya brought her children to the doctor's office, desperate for some kind of answer, a medical explanation for what they were experiencing, maybe. But the events that unfolded there defied science. It left everyone present speechless and would mark a turning point in this case. As their doctor examined the kids' behavior took a terrifying turn. They began to speak in deep, unnatural voices, growling and snarling in a way that no one could explain. Then, as the doctor and his staff looked on, one of the boys was suddenly lifted off the ground and thrown across the room by an unseen force. Both of the boys then passed out, and they did not regain consciousness. In that moment, the doctor called for help and dialed 911. So paramedics and police officers arrived on the scene at the doctor's office, unsure of what to make of what they'd heard. The children were then transported to North Lake Methodist Hospital, where a Department of Child Services DCS case manager, Valerie Washington, was called to the hospital to investigate potential abuse. But instead, what she witnessed would haunt her for years. In the examination room, with Miss Washington, a nurse, and Rosa present, the youngest boy began to growl, his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and then he began to walk backwards. His grandmother, Rosa, grabbed his hand, and he stopped walking when he hit the wall, but then he continued on, walking backwards up the wall, all the way to the ceiling, where he then flipped over and landed on his feet on the other side of his grandmother. No one could believe what they were seeing, and there was nothing they could do but watch, frozen in fear. The next day, after the incident at the hospital, DCS determined that the children might be in danger, not just from outside forces, but potentially from within the family. Without a court order, DCS removed the children from LaToya's care. The two older children were placed at St. Joseph's Carmelite Home in East Chicago, Indiana. This is an emergency shelter for children. The youngest child was placed at Christian Haven in Wheatfield, Indiana, for a psychiatric evaluation after several attempts to have him placed in foster care were all refused. It was during these evaluations that the children's claims of demonic possession came to light, alongside LaToya's insistence that these dark forces had overtaken her family. Meanwhile, the family's story spread within the community, and soon, a hospital chaplain, concerned by what he'd heard, contacted a Father Michael Maginot, asking if he could help. He believed that something spiritual was affecting this family, and that conventional help might not be enough. So 2 days later, on April 22nd of 2012, Father Maginot met with LaToya and her mother Rosa after a Sunday Mass. When he got to the home where LaToya and Rosa were waiting, it didn't take Father Maginot long for him to experience the strangeness himself. Lights would flicker without reason when he would walk towards them, and when he walked away, they would stop. An oily residue appeared on the blinds. As he moved throughout the house, wet footprints seemed to just materialize on the floor. And as he was there, LaToya's distress grew apparent, her body convulsing and shaking uncontrollably as he prayed. It was clear to Father Maginot that this was no ordinary case. What he witnessed in that house convinced him that this family needed a full exorcism, not just a blessing. Determined to help, he prepared a report for Bishop Dale Melchek, seeking permission to perform the rite of exorcism for LaToya. A few days later, on April 25th, authorities had started growing increasingly involved in the Ammons case. Lake County and Hammond County police conducted an investigation at the Carolina Street house, trying to uncover a logical explanation for these bizarre events. But instead of answers, they found only more questions. In the basement, they found the altar that had been placed there earlier, and they located the dirt floor under the stairs. One officer thought that it looked strange because it looked like the concrete had been broken up and this area had been specifically dug out. So they decided to dig themselves. And in this dirt, they found a pink press-on fingernail about 2 feet deep. They found a pair of women's underwear, a heavy metal object that no one knew what it could be, possibly a weight for a drapery cord. They found the tops of various candy bar wrappers, a pair of socks with the bottoms cut off below the ankles, beads, a red oval lid that may have come from a teapot, and broken pieces of what they think was a shoehorn at some point. Could these have been remnants of someone trying to curse the home? The press-on nail and the underwear, along with other personal belongings, could lead to that thought. Or was it just a time capsule of sorts? Now, during their investigation, officers also experienced some strange things. Their equipment would malfunction. Voice recorders would capture strange sounds, including eerie voices that no one in the house could account for. And pictures taken during the investigation, especially underneath the stairs, seemed to show 2 ghostly faces staring back into the camera. Captain Austin, a seasoned police officer and self-proclaimed skeptic, entered the house, doubting every story he'd ever heard about it. But by the time he left, he admitted that he had become a believer. The evidence, both tangible and intangible, suggested that this house was indeed different. On May 2nd, with all of this mounting evidence of the paranormal and this very deeply troubled family, Father Maginot submitted his report to Bishop Melchek, asking for formal permission to perform an exorcism on LaToya. This was not a request that he took lightly, and at the time, the bishop did not grant permission immediately. The church needed more solid evidence to support such an extraordinary measure. On May 10th, a DCS worker and the police showed back up at the house. Now, this is not the original DCS caseworker that was on the case, Miss Washington. She was the one who had witnessed the youngest son walk up the wall. She did not want to go to the Ammons house, and she removed herself from the case. Even years later, she admitted to having had to go to therapy, and she moved far away from Gary, Indiana. A new caseworker, Miss Illick, was assigned to this case, and she is the one who went with the police to the Ammons house along with Father Maginot. Now, during the investigation, the police noticed that strange oily-like substance on the blinds in one of the bedrooms. Now, looking all over, they could not find the source of the oil. Miss Illick touched it, and she said it felt strange, slippery, and sticky. Shortly after touching it, her pinky finger began to turn completely white, and she said it tingled. The officers then decided to perform an experiment. So what they did is they wiped the blinds clean, they shut the door, and guarded the door for an hour. After the hour was up, they opened the door, and there again was the oily substance on the blinds. They had no explanation for how it got there. After being at the house and touching that substance, Miss Illick would suffer from a series of events that could not be considered coincidental. She had gone jet skiing and suffered broken ribs. She then broke her hand and her ankle in another incident, and she suffered third-degree burns from a motorcycle accident. In June of 2012, by this time, Bishop Melchek had granted permission for Father Maginot to conduct a series of exorcisms on LaToya Ammons. The first 2 were minor exorcisms, as Father Maginot had not yet received permission to do a major exorcism. And by this time, LaToya and her mom had moved to Indianapolis, but the kids were still in state custody. Father Maginot visited the house in Indianapolis and blessed it, hoping to keep anything negative at bay. When the major exorcism was finally granted, Father Maginot had LaToya come to his church It was there that he performed the exorcism. LaToya convulsed and struggled. Her body reacted violently as the prayers were read. It was only after the final exorcism that LaToya began to feel peace return to her life. She described the entire process as intensely painful, feeling like something inside of her was trying to resist and inflict pain at the same time. While she was there, she also attended court hearings about her children and her attempt to gain custody back. She also personally underwent psychological evaluations. And probably to the surprise of doctors, she was found to be of sound mind, showing no signs of psychosis. It wasn't until November of 2012, after months of monitoring, that LaToya was finally reunited with her children. The DCS did continue to check in with the family, ensuring that the children were safe and that no further incidents were occurring. And by January of 2013, DCS even recommended that the case be dismissed. LaToya had complied with every court order, and there were no further safety concerns. And by February, the case was officially closed. But for the Ammons family and all who witnessed their ordeal, the memories of what happened on Carolina Street lingered. The house itself would eventually be demolished, but questions about what truly happened within its walls would remain. And that's where the second phase of the Carolina house begins. Because about a year after the Ammons family left the Carolina Street house, it drew the attention of one of the paranormal world's most recognizable figures, Zak Bagans, known for his investigations into haunted locations around the world on the Discovery series Ghost Adventures. He purchased the house in 2014, intrigued by the dark events that had reportedly gone on with LaToya and her family. And what he intended to do was to document whatever spirits lingered within its walls and to capture evidence of the supernatural forces that had terrorized LaToya's family. But what Zak encountered in the house would soon lead him down a path that he never anticipated. During his investigation, Bagans and his crew experienced a series of strange and disturbing events. Equipment malfunctions, unsettling sounds, and mysterious physical symptoms affected those who entered the house. Even Zak himself reported feeling a dark presence, one so oppressive that he became physically ill. He described it as a sense of dread unlike anything he'd encountered in his years of investigating. And after completing his investigation, he made a surprising decision. Despite the potential for continued paranormal research, he actually felt that the house's energy was simply too dark, too dangerous. In his words, the house was a portal to hell. Concerned for the safety of others who might enter the house, he chose to demolish it in 2016, erasing it from the landscape of Gary, Indiana. He did, however, record a documentary called Demon House. If you want to know what happened to those who were involved, including one crew member who quit, one scientist who was in good health who ended up having organ failure with no specific cause, and more, I highly suggest that you watch it. It was the very last time that the house was ever filmed before its destruction. And so this house on Carolina Street no longer stands. But this doesn't mean that what was once there is actually gone. Since the destruction of the home, people have reported headaches, tunnel vision, and nausea. Paranormal enthusiasts still visit the now vacant lot. So what really happened inside that house? Was it a true haunting, a portal to another world, as some claim, or was it a case of mass hysteria and coincidence? And what about the original family that lived in the house? Do you think that these are all connected? Now, in the end, the answer might depend on just simply who you ask. You know, for LaToya Ammons and her family, for the police officers and caseworkers and Zak Bagans, this house was a place that challenged reality and blurred the line between belief and doubt. And that will do it for this episode. Before we wrap up today, I wanted to give you a quick update. Next week, I'll be taking a short break, but I didn't want to leave you with an empty feed. So I've chosen one of our original episodes to re-release. This is a story that many of you found intriguing and one that deserves another listen. It's a chance to dive back into a case that still raises questions. And if you're new to the podcast, it might even be one you haven't heard yet. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. I'll be back the following week with brand new content. But in the meantime, I hope this story keeps you engaged and wondering. As always, stay curious and stay safe. Bye for now.